The gleam of ceramic caught my eye before I even noticed the ring. Claire had placed it deliberately in the small dish we'd bought years ago, the one that usually held her car keys and loose change, and now it cradled her wedding band like a challenge. My chest tightened. I set my laptop bag down, keeping my expression neutral, while every detail screamed that nothing would ever be the same. Her posture rigid across the granite island, hands folded as if rehearsed, the half-empty wine glass beside her, the perfume lingering in the air, the subtle flicker of nerves behind her eyes. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, voice measured, practiced. My mind catalogued the timeline. Late nights, changed passwords, emotional distance, all lining up like red flags I'd ignored. I looked at the ring again, sitting there accusingly, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the faintest pang of uncertainty and knew the game had begun. The first thing that caught my eye was the glint of ceramic in the overhead light, a flash that drew my attention before I even realized what I was looking at. Claire's wedding ring, placed deliberately in the small dish we'd bought at that art fair 3 summers ago. The same dish that usually held her keys and loose change, now cradling her commitment, or perhaps a message. And my chest tightened even as I forced my expression neutral, setting my laptop bag down slowly, noticing her posture across the granite kitchen island, unnaturally straight, hands folded in front of her like she was about to deliver a presentation, the countertop forming a subtle barrier that felt intentional, a line drawn between us. And then her voice, calm and measured. "I need to talk to you about something," carrying that rehearsed quality I had started noticing in our conversations lately, practiced, precise, and before she could continue, I already sensed the pattern, her wine glass half empty beside her, liquid courage waiting, her phone face down on the counter, no notifications, and my mind catalogued every detail as a tiny pang ran through my chest. The first whisper of uncertainty suppressed immediately by calculation, glancing back at the ring in the dish, its gleam like a silent accusation, and I began to assemble the timeline in my head. 6 weeks ago, late nights at work. 4 weeks ago, password changes on her devices. 3 weeks ago, emotional distance. And now, a Thursday evening, 30 days of separation requested, while she smelled like perfume I didn't recognize, wore a dress I'd never seen, all calculated for maximum impact. And as she launched into her prepared speech about independence, personal growth, and emotional clarity, words flowing confidently, fingers fidgeting where the ring should have been, I watched her micro-expressions, noting uncertainty behind the composure, a search for reassurance. And when she paused, I asked the question she hadn't anticipated. "Do you want me to stay here or find somewhere else to live during these 30 days? Her composure faltered, the first cracks appearing, her carefully structured plan unraveling under calm scrutiny. And I stayed measured, unflustered, stating, 30 days, but understand what you're risking." Watching her eyes widen slightly, mouth part in surprise. No tears, no bargaining, nothing but the subtle hint of panic as the framework she had built for control shifted against her. And in that instant, I understood that the ring in the dish was more than a symbol. It was a challenge, and I intended to answer it on my own terms. 30 seconds of clarity sparking a methodical response in my mind. Mental timelines, calculations, strategies forming even as my emotions remained nearly contained. Just enough vulnerability to mark the stakes. And I realized then that everything, every late night, every change, every subtle sign of distance had led to this moment. And now, with the challenge set, the first move made, I would honor her request, yes, but I would do so while reclaiming control. Observing, documenting, and planning, and those 30 days would become a test of intention, patience, and strategy, the beginning of a journey that would not just determine the outcome of our marriage, but redefine the terms on which I would engage with it. Because the ring in that dish was no longer just jewelry, it was the spark that ignited a decision, and I was ready to answer it. Claire's words lingered in the air like smoke. "We need some space to evaluate our relationship independently." and I processed them carefully, noting the precise way she phrased it, her eyes searching mine as if for permission, her voice steady yet carrying that faint tremor that betrayed her rehearsed calm. And I looked down at the ring again, still in the dish, its quiet gleam accusing me, reminding me of the commitment it represented and the unspoken challenge it posed. 30 days of separation. Not just time, but a test, a negotiation disguised as a pause. And I listened as she described what she meant. Personal growth, clarity, rediscovering herself, words flowing with a confidence that seemed borrowed from articles she'd likely read about conscious uncoupling, all the while noting the small details that added layers to the story she was presenting, the new manicure, the perfume, the way she kept glancing at her phone even when it lay face down. Each movement cataloged like data points in a system I had long since trained to analyze. And when I asked the first practical question, how much space, her reply was measured. 30 days, no contact, no attempts to repair or talk things through, just time alone. And I considered the implications, the timeline forming in my mind, the mental notes of changes in behavior, subtle shifts in attention, all converging into a clear pattern of premeditation. And I asked again, pressing slightly, "When did you decide this?" "A week ago," she admitted, fumbling slightly, and that admission triggered a cascade of observations. The late nights at work 6 weeks ago, the emotional distance 3 weeks prior, the changes in phone and laptop passwords 4 weeks in, each step deliberate, a sequence that now framed her request for space as less a neutral evaluation and more a strategic move. And I maintained a calm exterior even as my mind raced, thinking through every possible outcome, testing her reactions with questions she hadn't anticipated. Should I stay here or find somewhere else? Her pause was telling, the smallest crack of uncertainty betraying her plan, and I noted it, filed it mentally, the first real advantage. And when she tried to regain control, insisting this was about clarity, I countered not with emotion, but with observation, watching her micro-expressions, the subtle shifts in gaze, the tightening of fingers where the ring should have been, the slight rise and fall of her shoulders under rehearsed calm. And I realized that her request, presented as a measure for reflection, was also a probe, testing boundaries, seeing how I would respond. And I decided then that my own approach would mirror hers, measured, deliberate, strategic, but unflinching. And as she stepped back to watch me process, I cataloged her behaviors, her words, the positioning of the wine glass, the dishes, the silence she let linger before speaking, all of it adding to a mental dossier. The 30 days no longer a passive pause, but a field of study, an arena in which observation, patience, and calculated responses would define the next moves. And I knew that respecting her space did not mean surrendering mine, that control could be maintained even while appearing compliant, and that the ring in the dish, still gleaming under the kitchen light, was a symbol not just of our marriage, but of the psychological chess game that had begun. And with the first verbal exchanges completed, I silently acknowledged the challenge. I would navigate it, not with anger or panic, but with clarity, intention, and meticulous attention to detail, because in that carefully staged moment, the rules had been set, and I intended to play them perfectly. As Claire spoke, outlining her carefully prepared reasoning for the 30 days, I watched her hands, the subtle twitch in her fingers, the way her gaze darted momentarily to her phone before returning to mine, and my mind began its methodical cataloging of every detail, every nuance, each seemingly small choice, suddenly part of a larger pattern I hadn't allowed myself to fully recognize before. The late-night emails she'd sent, the sudden distance in our conversations, the changing rhythms of our routine, all of it aligning like points on a graph that finally made sense. And I noticed how she avoided the word divorce, how she spoke of independence and clarity as if they were neutral concepts, when in reality they were tools, strategies to test me, to see if I would react with desperation or surrender, and I maintained a calm, even tone, asking pointed questions that forced her to clarify, to reveal cracks in the story she had rehearsed countless times in front of the mirror. The subtle hesitation when I asked if she had decided before telling me, the slight flush on her cheeks when pressed on specifics, the careful avoidance of certain dates, all data points feeding my internal analysis. And I realized that her removal of the ring, the symbolic act that had initially caused that pang in my chest, was a deliberate signal. A signal not just of space, but of opportunity, a test of limits, a measure of tolerance. And I cataloged it as such, knowing that the physical object in the ceramic dish carried more meaning than words ever could, that every micro-behavior and every carefully chosen phrase now had context. And my thoughts moved quickly to action, mentally running through scenarios, possibilities, and consequences, planning not with emotion but with precision, because clarity in this moment meant survival, strategy, and positioning. And I considered the implications. If I responded with anger, she would have confirmation of power. If I cowered or begged, I would reinforce her sense of control. But maintaining measured calm would shift the psychological advantage. And as she continued, discussing independence, rediscovering herself, and what she claimed was emotional clarity, I noted the rehearsed cadence, the cadence meant to persuade, to justify, to soften the inevitable confrontation that would come at the end of 30 days. And I silently vowed to treat this like the investigation it had become, collecting evidence, watching for patterns, documenting behaviors, tracking inconsistencies. And at the same time, I allowed myself a flicker of human feeling, a whisper of hurt, not enough to show, not enough to derail the calculation, but enough to remind me that stakes were real, that the betrayal was personal, and that the choices I made now would shape the next weeks, the eventual confrontation, and the outcome. And as she finished, seeking some acknowledgement or response, I leaned back slightly, taking a measured breath, keeping my expression neutral. And in that brief pause, I recognized it fully. The 30 days were not a neutral experiment in reflection. They were a test of control, a challenge, and the pattern was undeniable. And my mind, trained to see structure in chaos, already began formulating my first moves. Because understanding the pattern was only the beginning. Acting on it strategically and deliberately would determine everything. The moment she finished her rehearsed speech, I let silence stretch long enough to weigh on her, watching her posture shift subtly, the brief hesitation in her eyes betraying the confidence she tried to project. And in that silence, I cataloged every detail. The scent of her perfume lingering in the kitchen air, the faint creases in her forehead as she waited for a reaction, the way her hands hovered near where the ring had been, as if drawn to its absence. And I considered my own response, knowing that any overt emotion would signal vulnerability, any impatience would tip the balance in her favor. And so I chose measured calm, my voice steady, deliberate, the kind of control that commands attention without raising alarm, asking the questions she hadn't prepared for, the questions that dissected her timing, her motives, and her intentions, probing for clarity, yet masking my analysis behind neutrality. And as she faltered, the first cracks in her carefully built facade appeared, a micro-frown, a subtle shift of weight, a swallow that betrayed hesitation, and I noted it all, committing each movement to memory, recognizing how her mind was racing to reframe, to justify, to regain control of a conversation that was no longer hers to direct. And I realized fully in that moment that the ring in the ceramic dish was more than a symbol. It was a message, a test, an unspoken declaration that our shared life was now negotiable. And I felt the tiniest pang of betrayal, swiftly corralled, transformed into clarity, because clarity was what I needed to act effectively, to preserve what mattered and protect what was mine. And my mind moved rapidly, running through scenarios, considering contingencies, weighing the emotional cost against the strategic advantage. And I began mapping out timelines, tracing patterns of distance and deception, noting subtle changes in her schedule, her habits, and the details that previously seemed insignificant. The new manicure, the perfume she only wore on certain days, the sudden attention to phone security, all now connected as pieces of a puzzle I had been assembling unconsciously until now. And as I asked her the questions she hadn't anticipated about logistics, intentions, and the actual meaning of 30 days apart, I saw her confidence waver, her practiced speech faltering, and I recognized the power of patience, of control, of waiting while she revealed more than she intended. And in that room, across the granite countertop, the game shifted, subtly but irrevocably, because I understood that the first step in responding was observation, the second was documentation, and the third, when the moment was right, would be decisive action. And I let her continue, allowing the words to flow, the gestures to unfold, the hidden anxieties to surface, all feeding the internal record I was creating, knowing that the calm exterior I maintained gave me leverage, that my neutral expressions, the brief nods, the measured questions, were themselves tools, shaping her behavior, guiding the conversation toward truths she couldn't contain. And by the end of that exchange, it was undeniable. This wasn't just a conversation, a separation, or a pause. It was the opening move in a sequence I intended to control. And as I gathered my laptop bag and walked to the guest room, I understood that patience, precision, and unshakable calm would define the next 30 days, and that the real story was only just beginning. The next morning, the apartment felt empty in a way that spoke louder than any words Claire could have said. The absence of her presence was a statement in itself, and as I sat with my coffee, I reviewed every interaction from the previous night, every hesitation, every micro-expression, every pause that had hinted at what I now understood to be a calculated plan. And I realized that patience would be my weapon, observation my shield, and strategy my compass, because impulsive reactions would only validate her manipulations, so I chose methodical action. First, securing a place to stay at Casey's apartment, framing it casually as a temporary arrangement, while keeping the tone neutral so that Claire would feel no immediate emotional leverage. Then methodically cataloging every detail of the previous weeks, the late nights she claimed were work, the subtle shifts in emotional distance, the changes in routines that suddenly aligned with hotel bookings, the altered passwords on devices that had once been shared freely. And as I logged each piece into an encrypted file, my mind began to assemble the timeline, a precise lattice of dates, behaviors, and anomalies that told a story she had assumed I wouldn't notice. And with each entry, the pattern became undeniable. What she had portrayed as a thoughtful, independent evaluation of our marriage was in fact a deliberate orchestration, a test not of us, but of my tolerance, my availability, and my trust. And I reminded myself that clarity came from detachment, that emotions, no matter how raw, could not cloud the analysis, because the stakes were high, and any misstep could compromise not only the truth, but the leverage I now held. And while I compiled emails, receipts, browser histories, and call logs, I noted every seemingly innocuous detail: restaurant reservations that didn't include me, hotel bookings made under vague pretenses, text messages deleted with precision, all painting a picture of deception that had been quietly unfolding. And I realized that each small piece, while perhaps explainable alone, combined to form a narrative she couldn't deny, a story of calculated distance and deliberate concealment. And as I placed each screenshot and printout into a folder marked Timeline, I felt a shift, a subtle reassurance that awareness and preparation were more powerful than confrontation without evidence. and I paused to consider my next steps, knowing that while Claire expected anxiety, pleading, or emotional bargaining, my response would be measured, almost clinical, yet firm, a demonstration of control that would unsettle her in ways words alone could not. And by the time the sun had fully risen over Baltimore, I had created a framework: temporary separation with logistical clarity, evidence gathering with precision, and a controlled presence that would disrupt any attempts she made to manipulate the situation through emotion alone. And I recognized the subtle beauty of strategy, the quiet empowerment in acting deliberately while others floundered in uncertainty, the psychological edge gained by patience and observation. And as I finally closed my laptop and allowed myself a moment to breathe, I understood that the first moves in this carefully orchestrated game were complete, and that while the 30 days ahead were framed by her ultimatum, the real leverage now rested with me, because awareness, preparation, and measured action always outweigh manipulation. And the stage was set, the pieces in motion, and the next chapter, though uncertain in its emotional cost, was firmly within my control. The following days settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and loaded with unspoken tension, as I moved through my routines with a heightened sense of awareness, noting how Claire's absence was as telling as any presence could be. Her texts were sparse, carefully worded, attempting to probe my emotional response while revealing little about her intentions, and I responded with polite brevity, each word chosen to maintain neutrality while subtly asserting control, because the smallest reactions could be used against me, and I had already learned that every emotional flicker, every sigh, every hesitation could be cataloged and interpreted. So I treated our interactions as data points, a series of inputs to be measured, cross-referenced, and analyzed. And in the quiet of my temporary space at Casey's, I continued assembling the evidence, organizing receipts, call logs, emails, and digital footprints into a cohesive chronological structure, each entry a puzzle piece that revealed a deliberate pattern of concealment. And as I cross-checked hotel bookings against the days she claimed to work late, against the times her phone records indicated calls to numbers I didn't recognize, the narrative crystallized into undeniable clarity. The separation she requested was not for reflection or personal growth. It was a maneuver designed to allow her to explore outside connections while keeping me tethered to a false sense of involvement. And while part of me ached at the betrayal, I recognized the power in composure, in maintaining a calm exterior that reflected neither anger nor despair, but quiet awareness. And I realized that my focus on meticulous preparation would not only protect me legally and emotionally, but also strip away any advantage she believed she held. And I mapped out contingencies, considering every scenario, anticipating her potential attempts to manipulate perception, to elicit guilt, to create doubt. And I resolved that I would meet each attempt with calculated neutrality, documentation, and patience, because strategy, not reaction, would determine the outcome. And even as I went through each piece of evidence, I allowed myself to note subtle personal reflections, the sting of deception, the shock at the casual precision with which she orchestrated her absence, the quiet satisfaction in realizing I had anticipated every variable. And I understood that control did not require aggression, only the steadfast application of observation and the careful sequencing of actions. And as the days unfolded, patterns emerged beyond my initial suspicions. Repeated calls to the same number during precise windows of time, online reservations corresponding with her claimed work obligations, subtle avoidance in text tone that mirrored the physical distance she maintained in our conversations, all aligning to confirm the strategic deception that had been silently escalating over weeks. And I saw that my patience and diligence were already shaping the narrative, allowing truth to surface at its own pace while keeping me firmly grounded. And in these quiet hours of preparation, I began to feel an unexpected clarity, a sense of empowerment that came not from confrontation, but from understanding. and as I closed my files for the night, I realized that the foundation for the next phase, the confrontation, the undeniable revelation, and the protection of both evidence and dignity, was securely in place. And that while Claire believed she had orchestrated a test, a trial of tolerance, the reality was that the first quiet moves had already given me the strategic upper hand, and the remaining days would simply allow the pattern to unfold until the truth became impossible to deny. 8 days into the separation, Claire reached out with an invitation that seemed casual, but carried the weight of expectation. A setup, she believed, would pull me back into the orbit of her control. Candles lit on the counter, soft music playing, a wine bottle decanted as though to signal intimacy, and she appeared in a dress I had once complimented, every detail calculated to provoke a response. And I recognized it instantly, noting the subtle choreography in her gestures, the carefully casual smile, the deliberate timing, the way she touched her hair and glanced at her phone as though I would misinterpret the sequence as innocent. And I remained still, observing, my own body a study in calm neutrality, measuring her words against her actions, tracking micro-expressions that betrayed anticipation, insecurity, and a desire to manipulate. And when she spoke, "I miss you, it's been 8 days," I let the silence stretch just long enough to create subtle tension before replying evenly, reminding her that her self-imposed 30-day boundary remained, and that mixing signals only complicated clarity. And I saw the fleeting frustration flash across her face, a micro-reveal that she had expected a different reaction, maybe anger, maybe desperation, maybe bargaining, but not the analytical detachment that now served as my armor. And she attempted another tactic, softening her tone, creating closeness, reaching for my hand. But I stepped back deliberately, reinforcing the physical boundary she had herself requested. And in that step, the game became clear. She was testing limits, seeking emotional leverage, probing for weakness. And I recognized the familiar pattern of triangulation and manipulation, the subtle oscillation between vulnerability and seduction, a push-pull designed to create doubt and insecurity. And I countered with measured words, noting each attempt to ensnare my attention while refusing to provide the reactions she sought. And as the evening unfolded, I cataloged every gesture, every phrase, the timing of her glances, the rhythm of her voice, the attempts to evoke jealousy through casual mentions of her colleagues, all data points feeding into the growing mosaic of evidence and strategy. And I realized that by remaining composed, I not only maintained control, but also demonstrated the boundaries she had tried to dissolve. And in the quiet precision of observation, I discovered a psychological advantage. Her desperation, though subtle, began to emerge in inconsistencies, in hurried explanations, in fleeting signs of frustration. And I understood that patience and disciplined restraint would allow the pattern to reveal itself without confrontation, and that each attempt to manipulate, each subtle push, was an unintentional confession of intent. And as I left that evening, her texts arrived shortly after, a flurry of confusion, pleading, and attempts to redefine boundaries. But I responded once, calmly, emphasizing that all further communication would respect the framework she had originally requested. And I recognized that this was more than a simple separation. It was a test of control, trust, and awareness. And by refusing to react impulsively, by treating each interaction as both observation and strategy, I had already gained a positional advantage, the groundwork laid for future decisions. And I understood with quiet certainty that while Claire believed she was shaping the narrative, the reality was that my meticulous attention to timing, behavior, and evidence had shifted the balance, turning the seemingly passive days of separation into the first chapter of a deliberate, controlled response that would leave the truth undeniable and the consequences inevitable. The following week, every interaction with Claire revealed subtle but telling patterns. The casual texts she sent in the daytime were breadcrumbs, carefully designed to maintain my attention without committing to emotional clarity, and each one I cataloged, noting the timing, the phrasing, and the psychological undertones, while observing how she dropped references to Philip casually, almost like detonating small grenades meant to spark jealousy or uncertainty. And I resisted the instinct to respond with anger or curiosity, instead replying with neutral, even indifferent words that subtly reinforced the boundaries she herself had requested. And every evening her attempts grew more transparent, the messages coming faster, her tone oscillating between faux vulnerability and controlled flirtation. But my calm persistence allowed me to see a pattern forming, the repetition of behaviors across days revealing an underlying strategy she believed would manipulate me. And when she called one night, insisting I come to the house, I recognized it immediately as another test, another effort to blur the lines she had set. And upon arrival, the candles, music, wine, and attire, all carefully calculated cues, were not surprises, just data points to observe. And I maintained a measured distance, letting her make the first move while I cataloged every micro-expression, the slight twitch in her mouth, the shift in her gaze, the hesitant gestures that betrayed anticipation, insecurity, and the desire to provoke a reaction. And as she spoke about missing me, about wanting closeness, I mirrored neutrality, my voice calm, my posture controlled, reminding her of the 30-day separation she herself had defined. And the frustration that flickered across her face confirmed the effectiveness of restraint, revealing cracks in the carefully constructed narrative she hoped to present. And I realized that patience, observation, and the refusal to provide the emotional reaction she sought were tools as precise as any weapon in a strategic engagement, each refusal to react reinforcing my understanding of her intentions. And in documenting every gesture, every phrase, every attempt to triangulate or manipulate, I built a psychological map, a timeline of her attempts to maintain control while pursuing options outside our marriage. And the clarity that emerged from pattern recognition was undeniable. She had underestimated my ability to observe, analyze, and respond without impulsive emotion, and the realization that her attempts were leaving a trail only strengthened my position, turning her strategies into evidence. And I noted each escalation, each casual reference to Philip, each subtle attempt to evoke jealousy, compiling these into a mosaic that would later become undeniable proof. And I recognized that by maintaining calm, patience, and focus, I not only preserved my own emotional stability, but also transformed what she believed were advantages into vulnerabilities. And the awareness that I was no longer operating blindly gave me the momentum to plan my next moves carefully, knowing that each decision, each restrained reaction was part of a deliberate strategy to reveal the truth, document the deception, and prepare for a confrontation where the facts would speak louder than emotion. And in this controlled observation, I realized the separation was no longer just a pause in our marriage. It had become a window of clarity, a period where patterns emerged, intentions revealed themselves, and the foundation for decisive action could be laid, all while maintaining the outward appearance of detachment and composure that would prevent her from realizing the extent of my awareness until the moment it mattered most. By the middle of the second week, the pattern was no longer subtle. It had hardened into a predictable rhythm. Claire's attempts to manipulate and test me were embedded in every text, call, and carefully timed message, and I began treating her actions like data points in a project I could no longer afford to misread, noting the timing, phrasing, and emotional weight of each interaction while cataloging every deviation from her usual behavior. And then the phone calls started, each one carefully choreographed, her voice carrying layers of false vulnerability that clashed with the precision of her timing, the references to Philip inserted like calculated markers. And I resisted the temptation to react with suspicion or anger, instead replying with measured, neutral responses that refused to feed the narrative she was constructing. While every night I reviewed the digital breadcrumbs, each message, call log, and email becoming a puzzle piece, slowly revealing a larger picture, and I realized her patterns were leaving an undeniable trail, a record of premeditation she had thought invisible. And when I noticed repeated references to late nights at work that coincided with hotel charges on her credit card and phone logs linking Philip Brennan, the VP at her company, I recognized the consistency of her deception, the exact repetition of dates, locations, and excuses, forming a lattice of evidence too precise to be coincidence. And I began documenting everything meticulously, creating encrypted files that captured each interaction, every hotel receipt, each altered password, and cross-referencing these with my own observations of her demeanor, her subtle micro-expressions, and the odd discrepancies between what she claimed and the data I could verify. And it became clear that her request for a 30-day separation was never about reflection or clarity, but rather a calculated experiment to explore other possibilities while keeping me as a safety net. And as I sifted through browser histories, email confirmations, and financial statements, the magnitude of her planning revealed itself, showing a deliberate attempt to construct plausible deniability while pursuing an emotional affair. And while her outward behavior attempted to appear normal, almost apologetic, the digital and physical evidence told a different story. And the more I analyzed, the more I realized my calm, detached observations were giving me an advantage she never anticipated, turning her control tactics into a roadmap of betrayal. And every carefully staged text or call became another opportunity to gather proof. And the precision of her planning contrasted sharply with the mistakes made in her attempt to maintain secrecy, the timestamps of messages, overlapping hotel reservations, and patterns of device usage converging to form a timeline that left no room for doubt. And in recognizing the scope of her deception, I understood that the 30-day separation, which she thought would give her freedom while keeping me available, had instead become the exact period that empowered me to collect, verify, and prepare for decisive action. And this awareness, coupled with my restraint in responding to emotional provocations, shifted the dynamic completely, turning her strategy into an advantage for me, while simultaneously preserving my own composure. And by the end of the week, I had assembled a body of evidence so cohesive and undeniable that it would later serve as the foundation for confronting the betrayal with absolute clarity and control, ensuring that when the time came, every fact, every pattern, and every calculated deception could be addressed openly and with witnesses, leaving no room for denial or misdirection. By the end of the second week, the rhythm of Claire's calculated messages, her staged vulnerability, and the digital breadcrumbs she left behind had solidified into a pattern I could predict almost to the minute. And while she assumed her tactics were keeping me emotionally tethered, I maintained a deliberate detachment, using her own strategy against her, observing without reacting, cataloging every nuance in her texts, phone calls, and emails, noting the exact phrasing she used to elicit responses, the timing that coincided with hotel charges or late-night dinners, the subtle hints of guilt or pleasure in her voice that betrayed her careful facade. And while her words painted a picture of someone struggling with uncertainty, my collected evidence told a very different story. One of calculated exploration of options outside our marriage while keeping me in reserve. And as the days passed, I began to carefully stage my own movements, leaving the house at predictable times, maintaining the appearance of compliance with her separation request while actually gaining control over my environment and schedule, ensuring that I had both the emotional space and physical distance to organize my findings without interruption. And this strategic withdrawal created a silent tension, a vacuum that she couldn't fill with manipulation, as each of her attempts to provoke jealousy or fear of loss was met with calm, measured responses or silence, which in turn amplified the cracks in her carefully curated narrative. And in quiet moments, I reflected on the chain of decisions that had brought us here. The 30-second realization in the kitchen, the cataloging of late nights, changed passwords, emotional distance, and now the systematic documentation that turned suspicion into undeniable fact. And I knew that every hotel receipt, every time-stamped text, every email confirmation added another layer of certainty, creating a foundation that would allow me to confront the deception with clarity, authority, and irrefutable proof. And in planning this confrontation, I carefully considered not just what to present, but the audience who needed to see it: her parents, a third-party witness in Stephanie Brennan, and my attorney, so that any attempt at denial or manipulation would collapse under the weight of cross-referenced evidence. And I rehearsed the sequence mentally, envisioning her reactions as I maintained a calm exterior, knowing that panic, guilt, or deflection on her part would only confirm what the data already told me. And while the emotional toll of seeing someone I loved manipulate reality for selfish gain was heavy, I converted it into focus, channeling any lingering hurt into meticulous preparation, ensuring that when the moment came to face her and the external witnesses, I would be fully in control, composed and unwavering. And in these days of preparation, I also fortified my personal boundaries, clarifying what I would and would not accept, and keeping communication strictly within parameters that reinforced the separation she had demanded, while simultaneously building a case that left no ambiguity, no gray area, no opportunity for manipulation. And in doing so, I transformed the chaos she had attempted to create into a predictable, navigable structure, positioning myself not as a passive participant in her narrative, but as the architect of the next phase, where truth, consequence, and accountability would intersect. And as the week drew to a close, I realized that her desire for control over the situation had inadvertently handed me the clarity, resources, and emotional leverage to confront the betrayal decisively, confidently, and with undeniable proof, turning the 30-day separation into a strategic window to reclaim agency and set the stage for the confrontation that would change everything. The day of the confrontation arrived with a strange clarity, the kind that comes when every detail has been anticipated, every move plotted, and yet the emotional weight of the moment lingered just beneath the surface. And as I walked into the townhouse, evidence packets secured and my mind focused like a laser, I could feel the tension in the air before I even saw her, Claire, standing in the living room, the ring back on her finger, a subtle attempt at normalcy, a thin veil over weeks of calculated deception. And the moment our eyes met, I recognized the flicker of panic, the quick intake of breath, the micro-expression of fear she couldn't mask. And in that instant, I realized the psychological leverage had already shifted, that my calm, measured detachment over the past 2 weeks had unsettled her, her scripts and rehearsed lines rendered useless against someone who had observed, documented, and processed her every step. And I moved with quiet confidence, placing the evidence packets on the coffee table, each manila folder containing chronologically organized screenshots, hotel receipts, call logs, and emails. And I watched as her composure faltered with each document she opened, the careful facade slipping, revealing denial, then minimization, then deflection, a predictable cascade that I had anticipated, while I narrated aloud, calmly, steadily, the timeline I had constructed. 6 weeks ago, emotional distance began, passwords changed, late nights at the office, the subtle signs that any attentive observer could miss if untrained. And as I spoke, Claire's gaze shifted, caught between desperation and realization, as she understood that her carefully constructed story was collapsing under the weight of methodical documentation. And then the door opened again as Stephanie arrived, calm, collected, with her own folder of corroborating evidence, the symmetry of our separate investigations striking in its precision. And I could see Claire's panic heighten, her mind racing for a defense or excuse. But the data spoke for itself, unassailable. And I introduced my parents in the sequence, not for judgment, but to witness the truth, to prevent any narrative manipulation. And as the room filled with silent scrutiny, I outlined the purpose of each folder, each piece of evidence, and the logic behind connecting patterns across time, making it clear that this was not a hasty accusation, but a calculated response to repeated behavior. While Claire attempted to interject, her voice rising in pitch and volume, her arguments bouncing off the walls of reason I had constructed. And I maintained calm, letting her reveal her own inconsistencies, asking only precise questions that exposed gaps in her story. And in this controlled environment, the truth became undeniable. And when the final envelope was placed on the table containing the divorce papers, her composure shattered entirely, the reality she had tried to manipulate now unmasked. Her pleas fell on deaf ears, not out of cruelty, but out of resolute fairness. And I addressed her parents with gentle honesty, explaining that this action was a response to a clear pattern of deception and not a casual decision. And as they absorbed the evidence, shock, sadness, and disappointment etched across their faces, I realized that the months of preparation, observation, and calculated patience had transformed what could have been a chaotic confrontation into a precise, undeniable revelation of truth. A moment where clarity replaced manipulation and control had shifted decisively into my hands, ensuring that the consequences she had tried to evade were now inescapable. And as the room settled into tense silence, I felt a quiet affirmation that integrity and methodical planning could outmatch emotion-driven manipulation, setting the stage for the next chapter where boundaries, accountability, and final decisions would be made with absolute clarity.
The aftermath of the confrontation left the townhouse heavy with unspoken tension, a silence that spoke louder than any argument could. And as Claire retreated to her room, her composure fractured, I began executing the plans I had meticulously prepared, starting with securing a temporary residence at Casey's apartment, ensuring I had both physical and psychological distance while maintaining control over the unfolding situation. The evidence packets left in the living room a silent testament to the truth, and every text she sent over the next hours revealed her escalating frustration, alternating between pleading, accusations, and attempts to manipulate the narrative back in her favor. Yet I responded only with neutral, measured statements, letting the pattern of her own actions speak louder than words. The legal counsel I had consulted guided each step, reminding me that patience, documentation, and strategic positioning were far more powerful than reactive emotion. And as I reviewed the encrypted files on my laptop, I cataloged every interaction, every hotel receipt, every suspicious timestamp, constructing a timeline that was airtight, each entry reinforcing the pattern of deliberate choices and betrayals that Claire had tried to disguise as momentary lapses or innocent separations. And I noticed the psychological shift in her attempts to lure me back into immediate confrontation, the messages crafted to provoke guilt or jealousy. But I stayed detached, recognizing that any emotional reaction would grant her the leverage she sought. And the calm, methodical distance I maintained became a form of silent control, allowing her desperation to escalate visibly while my actions remained consistent and predictable. Each decision measured, each response calculated, from updating financial accounts and transferring joint savings to establishing clear communication boundaries through legal channels, creating a framework where the separation was no longer ambiguous and the rules of engagement were unassailable. And as the days passed, her attempts to provoke, confuse, or guilt me became increasingly transparent, which I cataloged meticulously in my encrypted timeline, noting micro-behaviors and textual cues that indicated the lengths she would go to maintain emotional insurance while pursuing other options, while I simultaneously strengthened my own life outside the marriage, returning to the gym, re-establishing routines, reconnecting with friends, and allowing my career focus to intensify without the distraction of her manipulation. And the clarity this structure provided was almost intoxicating, a reinforcement that preparation, observation, and self-discipline could turn a potentially chaotic emotional situation into a controlled, actionable plan. And when messages arrived referencing Philip or suggesting intimacy or shared moments, I maintained polite detachment, never offering the validation she sought, reinforcing the psychological principle that control comes from consistent boundaries rather than reactive engagement. And in this period, the strategic distance allowed me to transform confusion into clarity, frustration into action, and betrayal into a roadmap for independence, financial security, and emotional recovery. a period of quiet but absolute empowerment that allowed me to watch the patterns unfold, predict her next steps, and act preemptively, ensuring that when the final confrontation came, the truth would be undeniable and the consequences unavoidable, all while protecting my dignity, my emotional health, and the integrity of my future decisions, creating a space where manipulation could no longer thrive and where the eventual resolution would be clean, controlled, and fully in alignment with the values I had refused to compromise, setting the stage for the final moves that would secure clarity, closure, and personal freedom.
The next week unfolded like a carefully orchestrated chess game. Each move deliberate, each observation cataloged in my encrypted timeline, as Claire's behavior oscillated between false vulnerability and calculated attempts to regain influence, her texts and calls a mixture of subtle provocation and overt pleading designed to elicit the emotional response she no longer received. And as I tracked her digital footprint, I noticed the consistent pattern of interactions with Philip Brennan, late-night calls, cryptic texts, and hotel reservations that mirrored the timeline of our separation request, each entry confirming the calculated duplicity that had underpinned her actions all along. And I began compiling screenshots, credit card statements, and hotel receipts into organized folders, chronologically mapped to highlight a deliberate progression rather than random coincidences, while concurrently maintaining my composure in person and online, never providing the reactive engagement she craved. And the psychological pressure of seeing her carefully constructed narrative unravel without my direct intervention was almost palpable, a silent confirmation that her control had slipped, and every small slip, an overlooked password change, a missed deletion, a forgotten detail in a text, became a building block for the incontrovertible case I was constructing, one that would not only reveal the truth, but also establish my measured, strategic approach in stark contrast to her impulsive attempts at manipulation. And as days passed, I coordinated with Stephanie Brennan, Philip's wife, who had independently begun noticing anomalies in her own household, sharing evidence and observations that aligned perfectly with my timeline, creating a parallel narrative that confirmed the pattern of deceit from multiple angles. And together, we built a comprehensive picture, layering financial, digital, and behavioral proof that could withstand scrutiny from attorneys, family, or any external observer, while Claire, unaware of the collaboration, escalated her efforts to emotionally unsettle me, sending messages that ranged from pleading for reconciliation to veiled accusations about my supposed coldness, and each attempt was met with careful neutrality, a deliberate withholding of the very reaction she sought, reinforcing the psychological boundary I had established. And in this period, I also focused on solidifying my own independence, securing a temporary apartment, separating financial accounts, and preparing for all eventualities, from amicable resolution to full legal action, ensuring that my response was never reactionary but always proactive, measured, and aligned with the evidence I had painstakingly collected. And as I reviewed the compiled documentation with my attorney, the pattern was unmistakable, the timeline unassailable, and the strategy clear. Maintain composure, reinforce boundaries, let the evidence speak, and allow her attempts at manipulation to reveal themselves, turning what could have been a chaotic and emotionally destructive scenario into a controlled, actionable plan that would ensure clarity, fairness, and ultimately closure, while preserving my dignity, emotional well-being, and ability to rebuild my life without compromise. And through this meticulous approach, I began to see the stark contrast between control rooted in deliberate action versus the reactive chaos of her choices, understanding fully that the final confrontation would not be a moment of impulsive emotion, but a culmination of careful observation, strategic patience, and unassailable truth, setting the stage for an inevitable reckoning that would expose betrayal and establish boundaries permanently.
With the evidence meticulously compiled and organized, I began preparing for the confrontation that would finally expose the pattern of deceit, knowing that timing, presence, and witnesses would be critical to prevent Claire from rewriting the narrative. And every detail mattered. The order of hotel receipts, the timestamps of calls, the correspondence from Stephanie Brennan, all forming a story that would be undeniable once laid bare.
while simultaneously I ensured my own life was stabilized, moving essential belongings to my temporary apartment, separating finances, and mentally rehearsing the discussion to maintain composure. Because this was not about revenge, but clarity and truth. And as I walked through the townhouse each evening, I observed Claire's behavior through the lens of my documentation, noticing subtle signs of stress and the cracks in her performance, the lingering perfume, the glances at her phone, the small hesitations in speech that betrayed her carefully constructed persona. And each observation reinforced what I already knew. She had underestimated how methodical and detached I could remain under pressure. And I planned every step with precision, coordinating with Stephanie to ensure we had corroborating witnesses, aware that confronting betrayal without external validation could leave the truth vulnerable to dismissal, while simultaneously I kept my interactions with Claire strictly neutral, responding to her attempts to provoke jealousy or guilt with calm, measured statements that neither escalated tension nor revealed my internal strategy. And in those moments of observation, I realized how much control she believed she still had, the illusion maintained by my prior restraint and patience. And I allowed her to continue in that belief, knowing that her overconfidence would ultimately make her mistakes more obvious. And with each passing day, the urgency of finalizing arrangements for the confrontation grew, securing a neutral location, confirming attendance with Stephanie, Patricia, Douglas, and my attorney, Lisa, and reviewing each piece of evidence to ensure nothing could be questioned. While internally, I prepared for the emotional intensity of the confrontation, reminding myself that the goal was truth and closure, not spectacle, and that the presence of family and the corroborating evidence would create an environment where deception could not be sustained. And finally, as the evening of the meeting approached, I felt a quiet, controlled anticipation, the culmination of weeks of observation, documentation, and strategy, a carefully choreographed moment where truth would meet accountability and Claire's carefully constructed facade would face the irrefutable weight of evidence, leaving no room for ambiguity or manipulation, while I remained calm, measured, and ready to step forward into a new chapter of life with clarity, dignity, and the assurance that my patience and strategic foresight had set the stage for a resolution that was fair, transparent, and irreversible. The day of reckoning arrived with a crisp clarity that mirrored the tension in my chest, and as I entered the townhouse, everything felt amplified. The hardwood floors, the faint scent of lingering perfume, the neatly arranged evidence packets on the coffee table, each one a piece of the puzzle I had spent weeks assembling. And I noticed Claire's eyes widen slightly as she saw the organized files, the momentary falter in her composure betraying the panic she tried to mask, while Stephanie arrived shortly after, calm, collected, carrying her own corroborating evidence. And Patricia and Douglas followed, their expressions a mix of concern and quiet support, their presence a reminder that the truth needed witnesses. And when Claire finally stepped through the door, her face drained of color, the keys clattering onto the floor, I could feel the weight of the moment press down, the silence stretching as I calmly began to speak, outlining the timeline, starting from September 15th, when the ring had first been removed, through the pattern of hotel stays, late-night calls, and clandestine communications, watching as her denial shifted to stammered excuses, then minimization, and finally the unmistakable admission of betrayal. While Lisa observed with precise attention, ready to clarify the legal implications if needed, and Stephanie's quiet but firm presentation of her own evidence left no room for misinterpretation, the pattern undeniable, and Claire's attempts to deflect, justify, or manipulate failed at every turn, the house itself seeming to hold its breath, Patricia's tears streaming as she absorbed the truth, Douglas's jaw tightening with disappointment. And as I finally presented the signed divorce papers, the culmination of my strategic patience, Claire's composure shattered completely, the reality of her choices laid bare in a room filled with witnesses, and I remained calm, measured, unwavering, knowing that every decision leading up to this moment, the documentation, the separation of life and finances, the controlled responses, had ensured that the truth stood irrefutable, while Claire, for the first time, faced the consequences of her actions with no safety net. And I realized that this confrontation, though intense and emotionally charged, was not just about ending a marriage, but reclaiming my life, asserting my dignity, and finally closing a chapter that had begun with a simple ceramic dish holding a ring, now transformed into a catalyst for clarity, resolution, and the start of a future defined by honesty, boundaries, and intentional choices. After the confrontation, the days that followed were a strange mix of calm and calculated movement, as Claire's frantic attempts to reach me through calls, texts, and messages via mutual acquaintances were met with firm boundaries, her panic and confusion highlighting the consequences of her choices, while I methodically executed the plan I had spent weeks preparing, securing a new apartment, transferring finances, and organizing my life in a way that left no room for ambiguity. Every action a deliberate reinforcement of independence and self-respect. And as legal processes moved forward, Stephanie and I continued to compare notes, ensuring the timeline and evidence were complete, while Claire's employment and reputation began unraveling under scrutiny, her pattern of deception exposed without the need for drama or spectacle. And in that space of quiet control, I found freedom, not just from her betrayal, but from the emotional weight that had clouded my life, the clarity of decision-making replacing months of doubt and anxiety. And as the divorce finalized in March, with assets divided fairly and no contested children, I felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment, the kind that comes from knowing you acted with integrity and foresight, not impulse. And in the weeks after, I focused on rebuilding myself, establishing a routine that included therapy to process emotions, reconnecting with friends, improving physical health, and refocusing on career goals, the promotion I had been aiming for arriving just in time to mark a symbolic fresh start. And as I ventured into dating again, meeting Nina Wells through a casual connection, the contrast between my new relationship and the deception of the past was stark. Honesty, transparency, and mutual respect forming the foundation of something promising and real. And when Claire eventually reached out a year later, offering apologies and explanations, I received them with grace, understanding that closure is self-given, not borrowed, and that my life had already moved forward with intention and peace. The townhouse sold, the financials settled, and my energy now fully my own. And reflecting on the moment that started it all, the wedding ring and the ceramic dish, the 30 seconds it took me to recognize the pattern and start building my exit, I realized that what seemed like a small, almost trivial decision had been transformative, turning betrayal into clarity, chaos into structure, and uncertainty into empowerment, leaving me not just free from a failing marriage, but fully in charge of my life, my choices, and my future. A life defined by respect, honesty, and the knowledge that deliberate strategic action can turn even the most painful moments into the catalyst for profound personal growth and true freedom.